Hey there, welcome to School of Emo, the podcast where we dive into the world of emo, pop punk, and everything in between. If you've ever found yourself in your car screaming the lyrics to Taking Back Sunday, wearing way too much eyeliner in the early 2000s, adding a buckle or a chain to every outfit you've put on, you are in the right place. I'm Erin Judge, and each week I will be your fellow student, guiding you through the music, the culture, and the history that shaped an entire generation of angsty teens. I am not the teacher of this school. I am a fellow student, here to learn alongside you and from you. Together, we will cover a lot of information that doesn't really matter, but will remind us of the days of stalking MySpace channels and getting lost in chat rooms. So connect your dial-up, turn on your webcam, and let's go to School of Emo. Welcome back to School of Emo. Today's episode, we get to dive into one of the most beautiful people in the emo space, inside and outside, and that is Dashboard Confessional, aka the one and only Chris Carrabba. It is one of my ultimate goals to have Chris Carrabba on the podcast. Chris, if you're listening, I also live in the Nashville, Tennessee area. I would love to talk with you. We can talk in your studio or meet up for coffee or do it online. I don't care. But I would love to hear his perspectives over this scene as a whole, the industry, his experience with it, like how things have changed, like any interview I've ever heard of Chris. He has been the most genuine and kind of heartfelt person, which you would expect by his music. But it's unique, I think, to see an artist that is still doing it. They're proud of the work that they've done. They're connected deeply to the scene, to the people in the scene, and they talk so highly of it and are still learning and like on the journey of like creating and all of that. Like I think ego tends to get in the way for a lot of these artists, especially when they rose to fame in a like, very early years. But that's not really something that we have seen of Dashboard. And I think it's something that sets them apart and has led him to be just one of the most respected names in this entire scene as a whole. And he's mostly been a solo artist versus a full band. Maybe that was his secret sauce. Who knows? But we're going to get into it today. We're going to go through the history of Dashboard, how fans and the rise of the internet really carried him forward, and then his impact on the emo space and where he is today and what is happening in terms of his music and, what else is coming from the band. So going back to the origin, before there was Dashboard Confessional, we had Further Seems Forever. This is still a band, but at the time it was a post-hardcore band from Florida, and Chris Carrabba was the lead singer. Now Further Seems Forever has kind of been almost like an LS Dunes of a band where they have had, members kind of come in and out. They have rotating singers, if you will. I think Chris made his way back there a little bit. But at the beginning, that was the band that he was part of. That was his thing. He was the lead. But in the year 2000, right at the millennium, he recorded a batch of deeply personal acoustic songs in his apartment. Not anything super fancy. He had, talked about it later on as him writing songs that he truly believed no one would ever hear, that would never actually be shared. And so it allowed him this kind of raw vulnerability that he probably, I don't know, maybe wouldn't have fully put out there to that degree if he knew that people were going to hear it. That was the kind of music he put into Further Seems Forever. But with his music and with these songs that he recorded, they were deeply emotional, deeply personal. They were truly bleeding his heart onto the page. And he decided to record them, and it became a collection titled The Swiss Army Romance, which then eventually became the debut Dashboard album. He did an interview with Rolling Stone in 2011 and said, those songs weren't supposed to be for anyone but me. They were little confessions, but people found themselves in them, hence where the name actually came from. And the fans definitely found themselves and found the music. The tracks like Screaming Infidelities, as well as the sharp hint of new tears, felt like reading someone's diary or your own. They gave words to what a lot of people at that time were experiencing. We talked about this with Thursday. We talked about this, with a lot of these bands that were kind of in the early 2000s. And, as the millennial generation, just some of the things that we were all going through. And this was 2000, so a little before 9/11, like that obviously connected even more. But millennials, like we had access to a lot of media and internet and, all these different things, a lot of outside opinions and thoughts. We also had a lot more access to wars and difficulty that was going on around us, that generations prior just didn't really have as much access to, and they didn't see as clearly as we did in those early formative years. So our preteens, our teens, childhood, trying to navigate the world with hormones changing and just the normal stuff that teenagers go through, while also having a front row seat to how difficult the world actually was becoming and how dark and twisted it could be, and all these other things that just other people hadn't dealt with. And then our generation of parents didn't necessarily know how to parent us through that, right? And so it really opened the door for this emo community and a space for people to share lyrics and songs that could speak to what we were experiencing, allow us to process it through those lyrics, because we didn't necessarily know, or we weren't taught very well how to communicate it, how to work through it, how to process properly, right? So it became actually a really positive coping mechanism. And Dashboard was one that was at the forefront of that because the lyrics really carried Dashboard forward. So looking at Screaming Infidelities, going into the lyrics, one of my favorite songs, actually sing the song to my dog, Zoe at first, ran over there sleeping. As well, because they are big shedders, and your hair is everywhere is the most iconic line when it comes to having a dog that sheds. But the full song: I'm missing your bed, I never sleep, avoiding the spots where we'd have to speak. And this bottle of beast is taking me home. I'm cuddling close to blankets and sheets, but you're not alone and you're not discreet. Make sure I know who's taking you home. I'm reading your note over again. There's not a word that I comprehend, except when you signed it, I will love you always and forever. Well, as for now, I'm going to hear the saddest songs and sit alone and wonder how you're making out. But as for me, I wish that I was anywhere with anyone making out. Such a teenager. I'm missing your laugh. How did it break? And when did your eyes begin to look fake? I hope you're as happy as you're pretending. I'm cuddling close to blankets and sheets, and I am alone in my defeat. I wish I knew you were safely at home. I'm missing your bed. I never sleep, avoiding the spots where we'd have to speak. And this bottle of beast is taking me home. And I didn't pull the rest of the lyrics, but that's then where we go into your hair is everywhere, screaming infidelities. So iconic. But Dashboard, so looking at some of the bands that were around at this time. So we talked about, Sunny Day Real Estate kind of leaning into this world, Thursday, even like the Taking Back Sunday, kind of building around the early 2000s as well. There was a lot of teenage experiences in the lyrics, right? Like a teenage boy wrote these lyrics, but there was something really unique and special when it came to Dashboard that not only paved its own trail in the music scene, but in the emo scene specifically, where we are kind of dealing with more emotional hardcore, right? That hardcore being a big part of what was considered emo at the time through that second wave. In the third wave, we got this softer side of emo that I truly believe that Dashboard led forward. Especially being, I think, the solo person on the stage. There's so much intimacy and vulnerability that's there. And the lyrics are very similar. They're very similar to the heartbreak other people were expressing in their lyrics. But the presentation of the lyrics, the presentation of the song was unique. It was different. And it didn't fit into other spaces fully. At the time, it didn't necessarily fit in fully to the emo space, but became a huge piece of the emo world, in my opinion. You could disagree. I don't think that you're right, if we look at history post the 2000s. So we had one man, a guitar, his pain, shouting into coffee shops and basements, with fans actually singing louder and experiencing the music as if it was their own, which leads us to the breakthrough of Dashboard. So in 2001, Chris left Further Seems Forever and made Dashboard his full-time project. That same year, he released The Places You Have Come to Fear the Most, which is the album that truly catapulted him into stardom, especially in the emo space, right? This is the rise, right there at the rise of emo as a whole, as well as all kind of alternative music. Screaming Infidelities got heavy rotation on MTV2, and then The Boy That Had the Acoustic Guitar was now on TRL next to bands like Limp Bizkit, like bands that were huge at that time. Chris said in a Spin interview later in 2002, it was weird. I didn't change what I was doing, but the audience changed. The rooms got bigger, the voices got louder. So how did this paradox of intimate music with massive crowds, where fans were screaming every single word before this album was actually released, where did this come from? So it started, we're going to get into a little bit more of like the MTV connection, but with the first album that was never really meant to be an album, the Swiss Army Romance, Chris recorded these songs in his home and he uploaded them on the internet. So think of the LiveJournal, LimeWire world, MySpace eventually. He added these, he kind of put these online, put them out there. And I mean, he would say he gave them to fans, right? He's not one to really be ashamed that fans took them, but fans found them online, kind of stole them, didn't pay for them, but became obsessed with them. That is the reason why Swiss Army Romance became the album, The Places You've Come to Fear the Most. Because the fans online came across his music and shared it like wildfire. But while there was so much success at this time, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, as we've seen with all of the bands around this era. And for Chris, I think there's a very unique placement with Dashboard Confessional, where because there was more of an online virality, that like virality wasn't as much of a thing back then. Like this was pre-YouTube days, right? This is way before true social media, except maybe a little MySpace, right? But he experienced this kind of online virality. So his rise to fame wasn't hinging solely on Warped Tour. It comes, but it was more this kind of online, almost like an overnight type of success, where his entire world changed, but it wasn't so obvious that it was changing, if that makes sense, right? It's like a person that blows up on TikTok. Like it's not like you work a career where you're in front of all these people and you're in a stadium with the 1 million followers that you have, fully aware that those 1 million people know who you are and are following you, right? When you're online, the followers are there and maybe you have some awareness of them, but you're not truly grasping how insane this amount of people and their connection to you, their obsession with you, what they think about you, you don't know what that is. And so this was something that Chris was starting to deal with, and he was put into this weird spotlight. Something else that was happening at this time was the criticism of emo as a culture, especially Dashboard, and this kind of softer, if you will, more intimate, more vulnerable side of emo that was lacking that kind of hardcore that I think helped make it palatable for some people from the outside. Because, one review of this album, but a lot of I think it sums up what a lot of people were thinking around this time. Hasn't changed too much. was that the music was for sensitive, gender role enlightened, bedwetting emo boys. Another memorable review said that Carrabba wanted the terrorists to win, among other insults. Emo was treated as this less than, especially for men. And most of the artists during this time were men. We need more female representation in the emo space, especially in the early 2000s. But the kind of vulnerability in the lyrics, and especially the way that like Dashboard was presented, just a man, his guitar, didn't necessarily look like he fit into the working class man kind of role, right? He had tattoos, he had the dark hair, he had sort of alternative clothes, he was a skateboarder, all these things before a lot of this was cool and accepted. And he connected with men and women alike, but there was a bit of like a femininity to his expression. Now that's so strong and powerful, right? At the time, that was not well accepted. And I think we saw a little bit of an acceptance of this for a bit. And unfortunately, this kind of masculinity insecurity is kind of raging even now. But it was really heavy at this time. So you take this kid who loved music, wrote some stuff for himself, put it out there. People connected because of everything we talked about before with like the generation at the time. Well, then the generation that was a little older decided that they didn't like it. And so you put this kid into the spotlight and it's massive amounts of criticism. One thing I really appreciate with Chris is even in interviews today, but in interviews then too, he accepted the emo title. We've talked about some of the other bands, some bands that are credited to being like the founders of emo that never accepted it. Sunny Day Real Estate, Rites of Spring, Thursday. They never really wanted to be part of emo. They didn't consider themselves emo. Chris has almost like a fondness like towards that, where he didn't necessarily feel that he fit in because obviously his sound was different, right? There wasn't that hardcore side, but he was very much emo and the community welcomed him in. And he was like, yeah, I accept that I'm part of that, which was also accepting a lot of this criticism. And he wasn't fighting against that, which, again, one of the most beautiful people that exists, but definitely, I think, the most beautiful human in this space for that reason. He wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. He was being so like vulnerably himself. And I mean, girls were obsessed, obviously, because there's nothing more attractive than that, right? But that leads us to 2002 and MTV Unplugged, where this rise in virality completely took off and showed itself for what it was in the midst of all the criticism. So we had a guy with no major label backing, really important to remember. Success because of the fans, like truly like a Kickstarter, basically. Fans carried him forward, just had his heart, just had his guitar, and he landed a spot in a series that was usually reserved for people like Nirvana, Eric Clapton, the biggest names of the time. And that was MTV Unplugged. So this was a special moment for the entire scene because this kid who wrote these songs in private was paired with his fans screaming every single lyric from songs they illegally downloaded or found through LiveJournal or Napster. MTV Unplugged, like, even though there were such huge names that had spots in this series and on this show, it was like basically a live, small, intimate concert filmed. And not every band, even those that were hyper successful, had the same reaction of fans fully obsessed with their music as Dashboard had. And Dashboard only had like the one album newly released, that wasn't even marketed by a label like all these other people were. This was insane, unheard of that this would have happened. but fans were the reason why. So Carrabba said in a Billboard interview in 2003, a year later, I was terrified, but I knew it was a chance to show that this genre could be taken seriously. And it was. MTV Unplugged became one of Dashboard's best-selling albums. So it was like the recorded version of it. And suddenly emo wasn't just a subculture. It was a movement. It was a lifestyle. It was a new kind of page of it had been started. And people connected to it and continue to connect to it. And it's funny thinking about, Chris at this time, because again, had this online virality, led to media. Probably one of the first times he was like truly seeing it, right? And he did communicate, like in later interviews, he's talked about how like playing shows and people knowing lyrics to these songs that weren't even actually released was such a crazy thing, because artists who released music didn't always get that. And here he was like with music that was kind of put into the internet, and people kind of stole it and passed it around and loved it enough that they knew lyrics and they were singing with him at every show. Like, it was wild and something that he could hardly comprehend. He was very shy. He's still very shy, very nervous, like very much like an introverted person, which again, beautiful soul. Like, he's not one that comes across it. I mean, he could be fooling all of us. I don't know him personally, but he doesn't come across as someone who wants fame, who wants the attention. And he didn't, even with MTV Unplugged. Like, it felt so sincere, and you could see the kind of fear a little bit, but like also appreciation of like, I am surrounded by people who are sharing in this music that I created that's deeply meaningful to me, and they are screaming the lyrics back. Listening to it, I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to go like watch it, even just clips on YouTube, wherever you can find it. You can also listen to the album and you'll hear it there too. Like, people are screaming every single word of every single song, which is just completely wild. After this was aired, that virality skyrocketed. And he had the album that was released, right? Now this is being released. And it grew his fandom because MTV was the place at that time, right? This was kind of with MySpace as well, but most of us got our new music, like news, recommendations, pop culture information from MTV at that time. I remember the days of like waking up early on Saturday to see like the countdown of the best music videos, because you couldn't have access to it in other places. Before I had internet in my house, right? It was the only place where we could get that information. So teenagers, like, we were obsessed, and that determined who you went out and purchased, who you recommended. Like, we had to call the radio station. That was like the early days of streaming. It's like, call and say, hey, can you play this song, and hope that they'll play it for you. And you sit there and wait for them to play it. And there's no repeat, right? You just wait till it plays again. That was this time. That was the era that we were living in. And so him being on this show skyrocketed his virality. And he went from like no one really knowing who he was, this kind of shy, soft-spoken man, to everyone knowing and recognizing him. And he reflected on this time in his life, sharing how terrifying it was and how reluctant he even remains to be of it all because of the massive ride to success. And he said he remembered, around this time he got security, like security guards. He remembered like having a really fond like memory of them and like a good relationship with them, but how strange it felt having this in his life, and like it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel authentic to him, and he shifted from that to like just kind of hiding himself in public. But he's mentioned how even now, like, how difficult it is to know how to navigate the world after being on MTV, being available to everyone, and his music being so deeply personal to everyone. And most people, I went through the Reddit rabbit holes here to see, okay, what kind of experiences have fans had with Chris? Like, he's one of my, I would love to like run into him at a coffee shop here in Nashville or something, and very gracefully, hopefully just say hello or give a little I love you sign or something, some sort of like connection point that hopefully wouldn't be as overwhelming to him. But some feedback is, some people have said that he may come across as a bit cold because of his nervousness. But then other fans have said that in moments where it is kind of planned, like a meet and greet or like smaller intimate shows or things like that about how intentional he is, how he looks you in the eye, how he asks like great questions, how he's so generous with his time and his energy and very willing to like take the photo, like talk about something. Like he's extremely kind-hearted, which I think you see in interviews that he does, you see in the music. And again, it's something I appreciate because I love this scene, but artists in this scene aren't always the most like kind, grounded, confident, like compassionate human beings that exist, which is okay. They're artists, they can do what they want, but there's very few humans, I think, in music as a whole that come across like he does, which is really special. So I can only imagine what that was like in early 20s trying to navigate that. And I would love to hear more on that. I think in interviews, he's kind of talked about it a little bit, but again, still fond. I think he was asked in an interview in the last couple of years about if he would take that back or if he would have, it was in the Bobby Bones interview, where would he accept maybe a lesser level of success where he could still pay his bills, do this as a job without it being as consuming or him being as viral and known. And he said, no, like I want things to be how they were. I'm so incredibly grateful like for that. And I think he connects to his fans, which is really, really special. So MTV happened 2002. Then we go to 2003, where Dashboard continued to evolve. And that's where we got a mark, a mission, a brand, and a scar. And this is where Chris went from just Chris Carrabba of Dashboard with his guitar to a full band. So electric guitars, drums, hooks. And while the lyrics weren't different, they were still deeply emotional. They still kind of hurt, ripped your heart out, bleeding again onto the page. There was more of a rock to it. There was more energy behind it, not hardcore, right? We didn't get into screamo, but there was more, it was fuller, right? The sound was different. And so that's where we got songs like Hands Down and Rapid Hope Loss, which proved that Dashboard could scale up without losing its soul. In that year, in Alternative Press, he said, I wanted to see how far I could go without letting go of what made it work in the first place. And it worked. Of course, Hands Down became the closest thing that Dashboard had to a pop hit. I'm kind of crossing over genres. And it was a love song that was wrapped in nostalgia while practically kind of driving the summer in terms of vibes. It was everywhere at the time. And the lyrics, looking at Hands Down, breathe in for luck, breathe in so deep. This air is blessed you share with me. This night is wild, so calm and dull. These hearts they race from self-control. Your legs are smooth as they graze mine. We're doing fine, we're doing nothing at all. My hopes are so high that your kiss might kill me. So won't you kill me so I die happy? My heart is yours to fill or burst or break or bury, to wear as jewelry, whichever you prefer. The words are hushed, let's not get busted. Just lay entwined here undiscovered. Safe in here from all the stupid questions. Hey, did you get some? Man, that is so dumb. Stay quiet, stay near, stay close, they can't hear, so we can get some. My hopes are so high that your kiss might kill me, so won't you kill me so I die happy? My heart is yours to fill or burst, to break or bury, or wear as jewelry, whichever you prefer. Hands down, this is the best day I can ever remember. I'll always remember the sound of the stereo, the dim of the soft lights, the scent of your hair that you twirled in your fingers, and the time on the clock when we realize it's so late, and this walk that we shared together. The streets were wet, the gate was locked, so I jumped it and let you in. And you stood at your door with your hands on my waist, and you kissed me like you meant it. And I knew that you meant it, that you meant it, that you meant it. And I knew that you meant it, that you meant it. Iconic. Still an anthem, right? Of summertime, of romance, of young teenage love, and those feelings that you had. Like I remember hearing this song and it being around that time of life of getting like my first kiss and like those butterflies and all those feelings, especially as a teenager that were so kind of pure, but also due to raging hormones. It's such a special song. And it exploded. So it was already successful. I think even though there was so much criticism over the emo space, like Chris and Dashboard were more palatable. Like the language was different, the sound was different, the look was a bit different. So there was a little bit more acceptance across genres that you just didn't see with all the bands in this space. So that crossover to pop, made a lot of sense. And that's also where Spider-Man happened and the crossovers that led to even more success. This was actually my first introduction, I believe, my biggest, I guess, hook of obsession. So if Dashboard wasn't gaining enough momentum, the Spider-Man 2 soundtrack hit in 2004, which was, in my opinion, the height of Spider-Man. This was Tobey Maguire. This was Kirsten Dunst, the best of the Spider-Man, in my opinion. I am a millennial, so that's probably why. Somehow I got my hands on the soundtrack because I loved Spider-Man at the time. And I don't know how, I guess I bought the soundtrack. I don't know. I still have it to this day. And quickly became obsessed with Dashboard because number one, first song on the soundtrack, Vindicated. Getting to be the first song on any CD, like any compilation, is huge, especially back then. Like artists talk about this all the time with like the album playthroughs. The first like 2 to 3 songs were meant to be the best songs that they had to offer because that was what people were going to get like the kind of intro to then encourage them to buy the CD, buy the album. And that's how people made music or made money in music back then, right? Prior to streaming. Songs were not really just going to go viral. Like you had to buy the album and that was your hook to buy it. So with Vindicated being number one on the soundtrack, like the soundtrack alone outside of the movie and where it fit there was, I mean, that was iconic, right? He was the most important song on the soundtrack. That's how it started. And I immediately fell in love, like still one of my favorite songs to this day. Like will not scream it at the top of my lungs anytime it comes on. And it takes me right back to my little Mini Cooper as a teenager playing that song as loud as I could. So my love for his music really started there. But it also was not only mine, but helped reach more fans that maybe wouldn't have been the original audience. So again, crossing over into like wider spaces of, pop and other genres, but just also other audiences that weren't in the scene or even watching MTV at the time. So during that Bobby Bones interview that I talked about, Chris reflected on this, said that during this time, they asked him to write a song for the movie. So like the production team reached out to him, asked him to write a song, and he actually submitted a different song originally. But then he saw like this kind of rough draft of the movie, like clips of the movie, like a broken up version of the movie. And he kind of saw it being made, was really interested in it, and sort of separated from it. But then went into a songwriting session where he kind of subconsciously in a way was reflecting over the conflict of wanting something that you won't have but also want to have, and like that he experienced in the movie, and it led to these thoughts that led to Vindicated. So he watched it within like a day or so, was reflecting, wrote this song from those thoughts that he had over his experience watching the movie. So within like that day, he called the team, the production team, and asked if they would be interested in the song instead, because it technically was inspired by the movie, even though he didn't necessarily write it for the movie. And within just a few days, he wrote the song fully, shared it, demoed it, where he had to go out and do that, then flew out to fully record it, and it became the hit of the movie, the song of the movie. So was it even supposed to be this song? It was not meant to be at first. And then fate stepped in and led to more massive success because Vindicated, I would say you either know Dashboard by hands down, Vindicated or Screaming Infidelities. Like you can say elsewhere, but like those are some of the, like if you don't know them by one of those, like you're, I think, an oddball. You found him in a very weird way. Because those are the biggest hits and I think some of the biggest turning points in his career. So that was the height of Dashboard. They've continued. But before we get into like what came next in the rest of the 2000s, I want to talk about the fans and fan experiences. Dashboard Confessional shows were less like concerts and more like therapy sessions for like 500 plus people. And everyone had that one Dashboard song. Like if you started, I mean, it's all over Reddit even now, but even if I asked you right now, like, what is your song? Not the song that you know them by that I just talked about. Like, what is your song? The song that you will can like cry your eyes out, like scream to the top of your lungs, like have to go lay on the floor while singing song, which typically came probably after your first heartbreak or one of those moments, and something that, you know, has kind of snapshotted that period of time for you. Chris reflected over this too in a Kerrang interview in 2006 and said it wasn't just people listening, it was people singing their pain back to me. It was beautiful. It was overwhelming. Fans tattooed lyrics on their bodies. They brought tissues to shows. They proposed to hands down. One couple even walked down the aisle was stolen. Came a little bit later. This wasn't just music. It was medicine. It was meaningful. And it in and of its own became like a cultural like movement. Dashboard is kind of a cultural movement. And again, I think a more palatable emo experience that people had. And I experienced this because I saw them for the first time in August 2017 with my now husband. And we were at this like amphitheater. And it was so interesting being in this space where at this point in time, I was in my 20s, most of his like core, you know, the people that were in it, right, were the millennials. And so 20s, 30s at this show. And people like the diversity, like so many different people who didn't necessarily look emo or look like they fit in to this space. I think you go to some other shows and people kind of have a look to them, right? This space, not so much like a look. Like you would think that we were at either a pop concert, a country concert, like you didn't know what concert you were going into. But every song, it was still the same. People screaming their lungs out, singing every lyric as loud as they could, all in unison. It was really therapeutic. And it wasn't as much of like dancing around. Like, again, it was a different experience than what you get from maybe some other shows in this space. But it was really special. And I remember thinking, like, wow, this is such a unique experience. And it truly is so special, which I think that's what he was referring to around that time. We've lost our mic, so I'm going to get close so that you can hear me because the sound is going to change a little bit. Sorry, it happens. So now let's go to 2010s. So we're past the early 2000s, 2010s, Dashboard slowed down. Chris took time for his side projects, including Twin Forks. He even went back for a reunion for Further Seems Forever. And then in 2017, Dashboard returned with Crooked Shadows, which was a more matured sound, but still was very much hard on the sleeve, deeply vulnerable and emotional. Chris said, you know, to NPR at the time, it's not about going back. It's about carrying those feelings with you into who you are now, which is how his music has truly evolved. Like he has been true to himself. And I think that's the key of like that emotional vulnerability is like, there's always periods of time to talk about things and experience things. And he did a great job of leaning into that as he also matured as a human, not just recreating the old stuff. And then in 2020, Chris got in a motorcycle accident. So a little later in 2020, past COVID, which left him severely injured, his arms primarily. He ended up having multiple surgeries, had to relearn how to play guitar, and a very dark time in his life. Like interviews, I was going through some interviews of like early days and like around this time and then in the last like year or two. And you could kind of see it and hear it, even though he didn't necessarily talk as much about it. He shared a little bit of the story through social media and kind of some of the interviews he shared this, but there's not a lot of him like really talking about this time, which I think as someone who shares such deep emotional like experiences through music, like you can tell it was a dark, hard time. But I mean, you're faced with, is this one, possibly my life could have ended, and that's hard. Going through like 2020 as a whole, COVID as an artist, like that's already challenging. And then facing the reality that you may never be able to play the guitar again, you may never be able to do this again. That's insane. So he was going through all of that. But in 2022, had pushed through, relearned guitar, continued to write, and then released All the Truth That I Can Tell, which was a stripped back emotional, deeply personal album. I love this album. So good and was so needed at that time. I think, again, because during that time, like we were all going through a lot. And I think a lot of us were experiencing lots of different heartbreak and loss and grief, and even just grieving the world not being what we wanted it to be anymore, which again takes us back to what we experienced after 9/11, many of us as kids. And this album was really connected in that way, really special. In a 2022 Consequence interview, Chris said, I thought I might not play again, but music has always been what heals me. You can hear it. Like this was his way of processing, communicating, and sharing the things that he had gone through around this time. So looking back at Dashboard and emo, is Dashboard emo? Absolutely. Like, yes. But one thing I really love about Chris is how, like I've mentioned, how deeply connected that he is to the emo scene. And then as an artist, how he's welcomed that label from the beginning. He shared how at first he was surprised to be called emo. Again, he wasn't as hardcore, and that's mostly what was around at that time. But he also knew that what he was doing was deeply emo, and he recognized that the scene was creating space for what he was creating, and he leaned into that and accepted that as much as the scene accepted him. And if you want to argue that like he's not and that emo was completely gone by then, to say that I think maybe we need to redefine that version of emo, because artists that would still to this day not even accept that as a label just because the fans want it to be. I think there's got to be both sides of the street, right? Where the fans are accepting of the artist being part of this space and this culture, but then also the artist has to accept that as well. And if that isn't accepted in both directions, like, is it actually true to that culture? Should that person be labeled as like a, a leader in this space? Like, I don't know. Like, I think an influence, yes, but maybe it's something different. I think this is the emo that a lot of us deeply connect to and really know. Again, you may disagree, and that's okay. But even today, Chris continues to advocate for the emo space, like be involved in the emo space and push it forward, and seems to, again, really deeply appreciate the label, the scene, the fans, which is so incredibly special. So wrapping up, Dashboard Confessional made feeling vulnerable feel powerful. Chris Carrabba didn't just sing about heartbreak, he honored it. And he made confession cool and okay and accepted. He showed a generation that it was okay to cry, it was okay to be brave, and it was okay to be who you are and continue to stay true to who you are deeply. That it didn't make you weak or less than. It actually led to strength. He has a marriage, like a seemingly successful marriage. He doesn't talk about it that much, but he's married. He has kids. He seems deeply happy. He's gone through really hard things, but the smile on his face, I don't think you can truly fake that. Again, I've never seen him in person. I think I'd probably just be like, huh, like blind. Because his smile, he seems so pure and authentic, again, which is so incredibly special. I think it's because of who he is and this authenticity that he has stuck to since the beginning, and what makes his band so special and has since the beginning. So thank you for joining me on today's episode. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, leave a comment. If you're listening, leave a review, a positive review, so that we can keep reaching others and hopefully bring on some interviews. That is the goal. If you want to be on the podcast, you don't have to be an artist or anything, but if you have stories you want to share, bands you love, songs you love, parts of the scene that you just really want to be heard or you could talk about for hours, email me. It's in the show notes. I would love to talk with you. I'd love for you to come on, for this to be more collaborative with our entire community and not just me alone. But if you are just listening and that is where you find your space, I'm glad you're here. And I hope that you join me next week for our next episode.